Thank you very much for this very kind introduction and for the possibility to give this talk. This is a great privilege, and I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful to the Department of Jewish History and to the Gotthard Institute for the History of the Bund and the Jewish Labour Movement for the very kind invitation, to the Bucerius Institute, of course, as well, for the very kind invitation and their amazing hospitality here in Haifa. I'm here already 3 weeks, and I have to say I'm slightly disappointed by the weather, but aside from that, it's absolutely fantastic to be here, and I'm really grateful to everybody who's involved in that. I want to thank Osher, who did so much in the practicalities to host me here, and for wonderful support during my visit. And to Amir for setting everything up for today, and to everybody who's involved in my visit here. I want to thank especially Professor Markus Silber for his incredibly kind invitation, his hospitality, and his unwavering support and feedback and encouragement and so on over many years now, that have been really important for my personal development, intellectual development, for my approach to many of the questions that I'm working on, that I'm discussing here. I will have to make a preliminary remark, and I think that's kind of my responsibility to direct you to the fact that my trade union, the University and Colleges Union, which represents almost 150,000 academic staff at British universities and colleges, is currently involved in a fierce industrial conflict over an assault on our pensions, which are supposed to be cut between 35% and 40%, and which will make it almost impossible for young academics, especially from a working class background, to engage in or to follow an academic career path. I did check with my trade union, so it's okay that I'm here today and that I'm speaking today. It's not strike breaking, but I just wanted to mention that. And if I wouldn't be here, I would be standing on the picket line, but it's also a great pleasure, of course, to be here. Today, I would like to speak about the Jewish experience in Galicia during and the aftermath of the First World War. This is, of course, a different lecture than I would have given, or in some ways it's a different lecture than I would have given 4 weeks ago. And it's not easy, I think, for me and for many of us here, to speak about a region that is once again caught up in war and destruction. Once again, people have to flee their homes and become refugees. I think we have a responsibility as scholars and as historians, especially of this region, to speak out about this horrific situation, to do what we can to support especially refugees in this context. Now to the content, and I apologize for the long introduction here. So my lecture will be like to make a few observations that, in my opinion, touch a number of key problems of modern European Jewish history and of European history in general, which I believe can be made if we look at the microcosm of late Habsburg Galicia, of Galicia during the First World War and in its immediate aftermath. 3 observations. So the first is the relation between Jews and the Habsburg Empire, and whether we should rethink some of the ideas and conceptions that we have about that. The second relates to the dynamics of anti-Jewish violence, where I think we can make a new approach and new ideas when we look at it from a local perspective. And the third question or observation relates to how people who were affected by this violence, by anti-Semitism and discrimination, made sense of that, how they explained it, and what proposals and what solutions did they think about when they addressed these experiences. I will begin with a truly dark day in the history of the Jews of Krakow. On Wednesday, 17th April 1918, Pesach Gemeller was assaulted in the tramway. He was 52, a pious man from Stri in East Galicia. He had come all the way to Krakow to see his son. Some sources tell us that his son had been drafted to the army, and his father wanted to say goodbye to him one last time before he would be sent to the front. Other sources tell us that his son was wounded and lay in a Krakow hospital. We don't know whether Pesach Gemeller managed to see his son, but we know that he never returned to his native Stri, because the mob had recognized him as a Jew. They beat him, they dragged him out of the tramway, and they continued to beat him until he no longer breathed. The hastily produced autopsy report stated what is all too familiar to us today when we read the news of racist murders: that the victim allegedly had a pre-existing heart condition, that the violence inflicted on him, the authorities claimed, supposedly had nothing to do with his death. The murder of Pesach and Meller and the events surrounding them, while largely forgotten today, in many ways marked a turning point in the history of the Jews of Galicia. On the day before the murder, a conflict over grain prices on the local market had erupted into an outburst of violence against the local Jewish community. Women, youngsters, soldiers, both regular soldiers of the regular army and of the Polish Legion, rioted. They attacked Jewish shops and homes and beat people whom they identified as Jews. And the police stood idly by. Those who turned to the police, asked for help, were told, "We have no orders to intervene." When the mob receded in the night, it would come back in the following day and turn its violence and rage against the Jewish quarter of Kazimierz. After the initial shock, and in the face of the authorities' indifference, some in the Jewish community reacted. A hastily produced handwritten leaflet, you can see that here, called on Jews together in front of Temple Synagogue at the northwestern end of Kazimierz. The only chance for rescue is that all Jews stand together in Popierzy 25. A police report stated on the following day that, quote, around midday, over 100 young Jews gathered in the old Jewish temple in Szeroka Street, armed with sticks, iron rods, etc. End quote. Besides the more militant activists, most of whom appear to have been supporters of Coalition and the Zionist organization, several thousand Jews gathered in the streets of Kazimierz to protect their neighborhood. It was only then that the police, as well as the nearby stationed army garrison, began to show some real interest in the situation and decided to restore order. They cracked down on both the rioters and those who wanted to defend the Jewish quarter. It was Shabbat and the town was quiet, but the Jews had to mourn more than one loss. In a way, they had to mourn the end of an old world in these days. They had to mourn the loss of an established security strategy that had rested on the assumption that the state would protect them against violence and discrimination. The old, almost legendary bond between the Jews of the Habsburg Empire and their state and their monarch, so immortalized in the writings of Josef Roth and so many other authors, was ruptured. But the fault lines opened not only in Krakow. And while April 1918, I would argue, was a key moment, it was not the only one. And regionally and locally, these moments differed. Throughout the war, Galician Jews were subject to discrimination and harassment and persecution. Most prominently, obviously, by the Russian regime, or the Russian military authorities during the brief occupation of East Galicia, but also, and very traumatically, by the Austrian authorities themselves. In Rohatin, Jews were not allowed to leave the village anymore. While in Buršatin, local commanders had taken all their livestock, and in neighboring Buštin, they were no longer allowed to walk on the sidewalks. In Shirachov, the local Austrian commander forced Jewish civilians to dismantle the old Russian trenches, confiscated homes, and refused travel permits, and so on. There is an abundance, if we look at the archives, there's an abundance of complaints, of petitions and lamentations about such mistreatment by local authorities. And it was more than just rogue local actors. Even the Army High Command wrote that it would be, quote, welcome if in the economic interest of the East Galician population it were possible to give control over trade, which in the smaller towns and on the countryside is an exclusively Jewish domain, into other hands, end quote. Not only did the implicit exclusion of the Jews from the Galician population already foreshadow later ethno-nationalist exclusionary practices, but in the struggle over resources and security and survival, the Jewish population could hardly count on traditional support from the central state any longer. The great significance of this, I believe, lies in the fact that Galician Jews and Austro-Hungarian Jews in general had expected something else. They had genuinely hoped for protection and security from the Habsburg state, as they had done for decades. What they experienced instead was nothing short of betrayal. Even the Austrian command in Przemysl acknowledged this in its regular report on the mood of the population, which was always divided into three sections, the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Jews. And I quote, writing on the section about the Jews, quote, following patriotic enthusiasm after the Austrian troops' entry, there is now a sobering up, end quote. And it continued, amongst the population, even amongst the higher classes, one can often hear that it is irrelevant who rules. End quote. This experience should tell us two things, I believe. First, it should cause us to question the trope of Jews' eternal and unshakable affinity to the Habsburg state, so codified in much of the historiography and popular memory. If we move away from the center, that is Vienna, Prague, and Budapest, the perspectives tell us a different story. Second, it should place the Jewish experience in a wider context. Galician Jewish experience is intimately connected to that of other communities in the Habsburg Empire, and to the decline and eventual disintegration of the state. Whereas for decades, historiography has explained Austria-Hungary's collapse as a supposedly natural process due to its multinational character, the ancient trope of the prison of peoples that had to be broken. More recent research emphasizes the role of the war. I'm thinking about Peter Judson, Tara Sacher, and Gabo Egri, and Lawrence Cole, John Deak, and so many others. It shows how the state's inability to guarantee provisions, security, and the rule of law led to the alienation of citizens from the state and caused the bond, the social contract, if you will, between citizens and the state to rupture. And the Jewish experience was part of this wider story. It was unique, of course, in the way that, unlike Poles, Czechs, or Italians, Jews would afterwards not find themselves in a state that was supposedly their own. But the process of nationalization, as a response to the failure of the multinational state and the collapse of intercommunal relations, was similar. We see very similar dynamics there. So let us return to Krakow. On the funeral procession of Pesach Gemelle, activists who had been involved in the organization of the self-defense distributed the following leaflet, quote, "In an inhuman way, all Jews and defenseless women have been beaten. Innocent blood has been spilled. This was done by the brutalized, zerwilderte mob, amongst which there were also many bourgeois and so-called intelligent elements, even Polish defenders of the fatherland, legionaries. Jews, whoever holds our honor sacred, shall join the ranks of the fighters for human rights and our national freedom." End quote. Now, this leaflet already points towards a new Jewish response to this crisis. No longer could Jews appeal to the highest authority in the land. The famed Royal Alliance no longer existed, or at least it no longer worked. Instead, national self-organization and national freedom were intimately connected to the protection and safety of the community. Others would go even further. The international newsletter of Coalition described the violence as, quote, "a pogrom styled after Kishinev," end quote, and stated that, quote, "the Austrian government and the authorities of Galicia are aware of their joint responsibility for the current situation in Galicia," end quote. Both the reference to the 1903 Russian pogrom, which in the traditional narrative had been orchestrated by the Russian imperial elites, Russian imperial regime, and insistence on holding the central government responsible for the violence, marked a critical turning point in the attitude towards the empire and the Jewish security strategies, I believe. Coalition had titled the above-cited article as, quote, "the permanent pogrom in Galicia," end quote. Indeed, throughout the last year and months of the Habsburg Empire, anti-Jewish violence in Galicia escalated, and Jews adapted their responses. In Krakow, activists established what they called a permanent self-defense. In April, one of its leaders wrote, quote, "The self-defense, which is organized under Zionist and Poale-Zionist leadership, is working well. The mob did not make it a second time to the Jewish quarter, to Kazimierz. Some tried though. They received a terrible beating," end quote. Indeed, Jews throughout the region came to organize themselves and defend themselves. In the summer of 1918, the Habsburg Army Command wrote, quote, "Hunger has led to attacks on grocery stores, in connection with that to pogroms against Jews. The authorities did not always intervene against the pogroms with the necessary determination, which in numerous cases has led to self-help by armed Jews," end quote. The highly charged term pogrom was used by the authorities themselves. This violence happened simultaneously in an imperial and a national context. These were not mutually exclusive categories. It and the response Jews found against it should let us rethink, I believe, the relation of both phenomena. Now, the second aspect I would like to touch on is the way in which we understand the dynamics that unfolded after the collapse of the imperial state, namely the pogroms that swept through Galicia from November 1918. Much of our common understanding, and if we read most of the relevant literature here, the intercommunal violence and the pogroms appear almost as a given. They seem to just happen once the encompassing imperial state was done with. Just to illustrate that, I would like to quote from a call for papers for a major conference held in Vienna, of all places, in 2018 on the occasion of the centenary of the collapse of the multinational state and the rise of ethno-nationalist state-building projects. Quote, in the region of structural, ethnic and religious heterogeneity, this, so the events of autumn 1918, inevitably had to cause problems and in many cases lead to violence. End quote. The key word here, I believe, is inevitably. This assumption, so intimately connected to the way in which the collapse of the Habsburg state itself is understood, presumes that people of different ethnicity or religion were somehow predetermined to engage in violence against each other once the imperial state had found its supposedly natural end. So once the prisoners of the prison of the people were released, they were predetermined to engage in violence and to try to dominate the others. And this is an incredibly depressing perspective at the heart of such readings of history. It assumes that it is impossible for people of different ethnicities, religions, nationalities, languages, and so on, to share the same space in peace. Indeed, it seems almost natural for them to be in conflict. And violence seems inevitable due to a supposedly inevitable desire for dominance. And I reject this notion. Not because it is depressing, most of history is quite depressing, or because of its terrifying implications, such an understanding of intercommunal relations would have for the world we live in today. But I reject this because it does not reflect how people actually reacted to these enormous transformations in the autumn of 1918, I believe. We have to leave the centers again and go to the supposed periphery, and we have to leave the supposedly big developments aside for a moment and look at what people were doing. There were alternatives. Some of them only lasted for a few days or only for a few hours, but they tell us about people's experiences in these moments and about the ways they tried to make it through this crisis without necessarily trying to assume hegemony and without dominance, and trying to make it through this without killing their neighbors. So when the Austrian authorities vanished from the scene in Przemysl, Polish, Ukrainian and Jewish nationalists all founded their own institutions in the city. National councils that were to represent the nation's interests, and militias, so Polish, a Ukrainian and a Jewish militia that would keep order in the respective quarters of the city. Mainly at this stage against marauders and other criminals. Both Ukrainian and Polish nationalists made public proclamations in their newspapers and in leaflets, recognizing the Jewish National Council and the militia's right to bear arms and to protect the Jewish neighborhood. The three sides even came together in an albeit short-lived multinational city administration. And this was despite the war between Ukrainian and Polish nationalist forces that was already raging in the region. Or at its earliest stages, but still. This did not mean that the various sides loved each other. They didn't. But they realized in this situation that it would be best to work together to guarantee stability for a shared space of the city in a highly volatile overall situation. In Lviv, Lemberg, similarly, despite the developing and gradually escalating conflict, both Ukrainian and Polish nationalists initially recognized the Jewish militia and its control over the Jewish quarter. In fact, the Jewish militia, made up of over 300 soldiers and officers of the former imperial army, did much more than just protect the Jewish quarter. Josef Tenenbaum, under the pen name Josef Bendorf, wrote, quote, "The militia was soon established under the command of Hauptmann Eisler, and so many volunteered that one was forced to close the list and reject volunteers. The Jewish militia soon became the most popular institution in Lemberg, whose services not only Jews used, even non-Jews entrusted the Jewish militia with the protection of their property. Many Christian merchants let their shops to be protected by the militia. But also the two fighting parties, so Polish and Ukrainian armed forces, needed a neutral mediating factor, wherefore the militia could establish itself as an equally fruitful actor for both sides. In defiance of that, Under the strongest hail of bullets, the Jewish militia did its duty, providing food for the starving, bringing wounded to the hospitals, burying bodies, protecting the municipal gasworks, organizing the provision of the Jewish quarter, easing the hardships of the situation. End quote. Again, we ought not to paint a rosy picture, obviously, but we can see that relations were a lot more complex than simply an outburst of anti-Jewish violence. In West Galicia, this was even more evident. In Ksanov, in early November, a Jewish militia was handed weapons by the local Polish authorities, with the task of protecting not only the Jewish neighborhood, but the entire town from marauders and bandits that were roaming the countryside. In Krakow, the establishment of the Jewish militia was announced in a joint leaflet by the Jewish National Council, the Jewish Military Committee, and the Polish Liquidation Commission, the provisional Polish government there. It was officially a unit of the Polish armed forces and, at least in theory, subordinate to the Polish command. For this it was given weapons, ammunition and accommodation, and its high point numbered 1,000 men. So what happened? How did these relations that were not built on trust or not built on love, so to say, but built on an attempt to have security and at least stability in a very volatile situation where nobody knew where this would be going, how did these relations integrate? How did the pogroms come about? And the pattern that we can observe in all those cases is that once outside forces entered the scene, the dynamics changed. These outside forces came with different agendas. They had no regard for local arrangements and locals' attempts to find understandings and stability. For them, the war and their mission in it was an ethno-nationalist state-building project, particularly in the Polish case. And it dragged local communities into this murderous logic. In Przemysl, the multinational city administration and local arrangements between Poles and Ukrainians broke once largely Ukrainian forces moved into the city and took over quite a large part of the city. However, they still allowed the Jewish militia to function, declaring in their paper that because Jews had no plan of creating a state of their own, in East Galicia, that is, obviously, their institutions and their militia should be allowed to be maintained. For the Jewish community, the nightmare began when on 11th of November, Polish reinforcements under the command of Michał Tokaszewski that had arrived from the west took over the city. After pushing out the Ukrainians, they turned against the Jewish quarter. The militia was incapable of offering any meaningful resistance to the violence, and in the evening, one Jewish observer had to write, "On 11th November, dreadful events have taken place in our town, which have not been seen during all this cruel war. When Sazania, so the west bank of the San River, which divides the city, when Sazania was in the hand of the Poles, Polish rule over the other nationalities living there was chicanes and oppression, but comparatively it could be borne. But in the moment when the Polish army, having driven away the Ukrainians, entered the town, robbing and plundering and pillages began. Every man who offered resistance would not allow robbery was killed on the spot. So was killed Abraham Rotter, and Gross is near death in the infirmary. His father was beaten and hurt in a dreadful manner that cries vengeance to the heaven." End quote. As in other cases, the Polish command explained, or rather legitimized, and I believe to a part to itself, that this violence by claiming that the Jewish militia had supposedly broken its neutrality and fired on Polish forces. Writing in an order, so Tokaszewski wrote in an order that essentially commanded the plunder of the Jewish quarter. He wrote that about the, quote, well-known fact that in the battle over Przemysl, the Jews fought en masse on the side of the Ukrainians despite their promise of neutrality, end quote. Not only was there no evidence for this, obviously, but this became a stereotypical theme throughout the violent campaigns against the Jews throughout the region. However, I would like again to highlight how the local perspective was quite different. The local Polish nationalists, those of the National Council and the local Polish militia, with whom there had been cooperation before, those local Polish nationalists intervened and appealed to Tokaszewski to withdraw his order, assuring him that, as they had done before, that the Jewish militia was in fact neutral and there was no sense of enmity of the Jews against the Poles. And they succeeded with that, and Tokaszewski withdrew his order. But the claim, the lie that the Jews had broken neutrality was of course also most infamously employed in Lvov. But it was more than that, highlighting the destructive, and in all respects destructive nature of this ethno-nationalist project. It was the neutrality itself that in the eyes of Polish nationalists made Jews enemies. Elias Nacht, One observer of the events wrote about the attitude of the Polish forces towards the Jews before the pogrom. Quote, "The Jews were dragged from the houses and the streets and to the office in Leona Sobieski Street, where they were requested to join the Polish Legion. Of course they refused because they knew that there they would only be tolerated. To a lieutenant's question whether they would join, they declared, 'We are Jews and neutrals.' 'You are Jews,' he shouted at them. 'Damned guys, but born and fed on Polish soil. We will soon settle scores with you. I'll go out with the Jews.'" End quote. Similarly, Josef Tannenbaum quoted one Polish soldier as saying, quote, "The Jewish quarter will pay for its neutrality." End quote. And this is a really important and continuous theme. Some of you might know David Engel's fantastic work on Jews and the Polish government in exile. When it's still during the Second World War, Polish government officials said, "We will never forgive you for the neutrality in Lviv." Not the supposed betrayal or the break of neutrality, but the neutrality itself. Some of the dynamics and the background of the violence itself was similar to what could be observed in Przemysl. It was even to an extent the same forces. After subjugating Przemysl, Tokarczewski had moved his army north, where he tipped the military balance against the Ukrainian forces in Lviv. It was only then that all-out violence, first against the Jewish militia and then against the Jewish quarter and population, broke out. Again, it was outside forces that did away with local arrangements. This does not mean that locals did not participate in the pogrom, they did, but the initiative and the dynamic lay outside the city. We can also see this in Krakow and Czanów. In Krakow, where relations had been surprisingly good, and where the Jewish militia could even be dispatched to surrounding towns to intervene against violence, it was the arrival of the army of Bolesław Roja on 15th of November that ended everything. He ordered the Jewish militia to be disbanded and the soldiers fell into the Jewish quarter. Another pogrom in Krakow ensued there in March 1919, again with the arrival of outside forces, this time those of General Josef Haller, who brought his army from France. In Czanów as well, the Jewish militia, initially armed and tasked to protect the whole town, was disarmed by orders of the Polish Legion. It was then that local pogromists saw a green light to attack and to plunder. Local Jewish activists continued to try and offer resistance and protect Jewish shops and homes, but they were outgunned. In a letter, they wrote, quote, "While the Jews feared for their lives, oddly enough, in the church around which the Jewish shops were plundered, some kind of festive service was held. For the windows were illuminated in bright light, and the organ sounded loudly, like a triumphant hymn to the victories of the newly created Polish army and people." End quote. We have two different levels here, I believe, and two different ways of people making sense of the situation. The language that they had available and the language that they employed relates to the wider, broader concepts of Poland, of Ukrainians, or the Polish people, the Ukrainians. They talk about nation and so on. But it should not obfuscate the fact that these were still very much local stories and localized experiences, and they can have a very different meaning on the local level. And looking at the dynamics in these communities, I believe we may be able to see alternative ways in which people had at least tried to make it through this crisis. I'm not arguing for a counterfactual history here, but I think it's important to highlight these other paths and possibilities. Now, the third observation or comment I would like to make regards the way in which Jews interpreted the violence and anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism that they experienced. How did they make sense of it, and what solutions did they propose? Because my main work centers on the study of Zionism and Zionist activists in the region, their interpretations will feature quite prominently here. But not only were the interpretations and answers adopted by others, but given their prominent role in these events and their prominent standing in Jewish society, I believe they also carry a certain weight, and they're quite interesting also on a conceptual level, I think. Throughout the war, when addressing the authorities about anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish violence and discrimination, Jewish national activists always made a straightforward proposal which they believe would solve the issue and would address these vital problems. They always proposed the recognition of the Jews as a nation and a form of national autonomy. In 1915, when appealing to the imperial authorities over the mistreatment of Jews by Austro-Galician officials, Zionist representatives stated that the only answer could be, quote, an objective and just reorganization of the conditions of Galicia, end quote. When they described the suffering of the Jews under Russian occupation, they claimed that, quote, they have literally suffered for Austria in the truest sense of the word, and for this reason Austria must grant them their right, end quote. In October 1918, Tzvi Chayes, the new chief rabbi of Vienna, and quite controversially at the time, the first Zionist to hold this very prominent position at the head of one of Europe's largest Jewish communities, met His Majesty the Emperor and conveyed to him the demands of the Galician Jewish population, as he saw them. A newspaper reported on this conversation. Quote, every reasonable politician has to be aware that tolerable conditions in the East, especially in Galicia and Poland, can only be created if the Jewish problem as well will be solved in a satisfying way. In light of the pogroms in Galicia, in light of the ongoing pogrom incitement by Polish chauvinism in Poland and Galicia, in light of the political and national deprivation of rights and the brutal economic expropriation of the Jews by the Polish rulers, it was justified that Dr. Chayes spoke about the severity of the situation in respect to the bad relation to of the Poles to the Jews, end quote. So the violence was interpreted as an aspect of a national conflict, one of many national conflicts that existed in the East, Galicia and Poland. And the pogroms and the pogrom incitement were seen as resulting from bad relations. This was one and the same problem for which he proposed a solution. The article continues. Instead of working towards the necessary peaceful coexistence, the Poles stirred up conflict and wanted resolution only through total suppression. The Jewish people, which holds its national goods as sacred as any other people, defends itself against this. The Jewish people therefore demands a guarantee for its right to live its national life as a national minority and to organize its own matters autonomously. The only solution for the minorities problem in Austria in general has to be applied to the Jews as well. End quote. This argument was raised again in light of the horrendous pogroms which were mainly perpetrated by the Polish army and that swept through Galicia from November 1918 onwards. In early 1919, Leon Reich, one of the key leaders of the Zionist movement in East Galicia, stated at a conference, quote, the Poles themselves are convinced that the Jews will never be assimilated, and if they are honest, have to accept the only possible form of living together by granting them national autonomy. It is unacceptable to try with the most brutal means to destroy and expel a people which has for centuries strongly participated in the economy and culture of the country and have always proven to be loyal citizens. Poland itself owes its independence to the people's sense of justice. It has to be just to the Jews as well. End quote. What is remarkable here is that Reich explained the pogroms by referring to the alleged conviction of the Poles that the Jews would not be assimilated. Now, the idea of Jewish national autonomy was, of course, a key aspect of Zionist, but also various forms of diaspora nationalist and Bundist movements and ideas. And many who did not subscribe to national ideas in its various forms also adapted them, at least for Eastern European Jews at exactly that moment, actually. It would, they believed, allow for a flourishing of Jewish national culture and education and create true equality amongst the many peoples living in the very diverse spaces of Eastern and Central Europe. But why would this be a proper means to address anti-Jewish violence and pogroms? How did they believe, or why did they believe that having autonomous national institutions would protect them from violence? Essentially, I believe, and I'm really looking forward to hear your take on that, because this is something that I'm discussing with myself for several years now. Essentially, I believe that they did not employ a concept of anti-Semitism in regard to the pogroms and to this situation in general. Instead, they interpreted the oppression, the mistreatment, and the violence against Jews largely as an intercommunal conflict that almost naturally evolved from an improperly regulated cohabitation of two or more nations in a particular territory. In his 167-page long book on the pogrom in Lvov, Josef Tenenbaum did not use the term anti-Semitism once. He explained the Jew hatred, Judenhass, as he called it at one point, as a result and decidedly not the cause of A, economic competition between urbanized Jews and the Polish peasantry, and B, the awakening Polish national movement's misguided fear that on Polish lands there existed another non-Polish nation. Galician Zionists made the same argument when appealing to the peace conference in 1919. They explained the pogroms as a result of the conflict of nationalities in East Galicia, where traditionally neither Ukrainians nor Poles could claim an absolute demographic majority and therefore political hegemony. Therefore, the Polish nationalists, had always aimed to incorporate Jews forcefully and unwilling to subscribe to either of the homogenizing nation-state projects. The Jews had insisted to be neutral and had insisted on their autonomous national rights. The violence directed against this in this narrative, the violence was directed against this political aspect. East Galician Jewish delegation to the Paris Peace Conference wrote in a memorandum, quote, "But already this statement," so the statement of neutrality, which included the abandonment of the forced allegiance to the Poles, was considered by the entire Polish public opinion as perfidious treason. The Polish masses, traditionally full of Jew hatred, regarded the beginning of the national freedom as identical to the right to declare the Jews outlaws and to treat them accordingly. A series of excesses against the Jews in many towns followed. The most terrible epilogue in these excesses was the pogrom in Lemberg, which, and this is the key half sentence, I think, which represented a political measure to exercise from the Jews any movement towards political independence once and for all. End quote. And the memorandum also commented on other facts that had played a role. Quote, that besides the political tendency of the Lemberg pogrom, other elements such as traditional anti-Semitism, instincts for plunder and murder and so on also played a role, is needless to say. End quote. So in this interpretation, the main factor was not anti-Semitism, rather this was a side aspect alongside the will to plunder and murder. It was a rationally explicable struggle amongst various nations, to which there was also a rational answer, national autonomy. Such an arrangement, the memorandum's authors claimed, would diffuse the national conflict and would subsequently guarantee peace and security. I've mentioned it before, it seems strange to think that anti-Semitism only played a minor role in this massive outburst of anti-Jewish violence. To see the pogroms as a political instrument directed against Jewish political institutions and aspirations. And as I said before, I've been struggling with that for quite some time, to get my head around that. Essentially, I believe that it comes down to the fact that the people I cited here regarded themselves first and foremost as members of a nation, which is equal to all others. And I mean equal not in the sense of a political demand, we want to be equal, but this is a reality. We are an equal people to everybody else. And it would not have made sense for them, as Jewish nationalists, to see violence against Jews as something qualitatively different to the conflict, to the violence and the conflicts between Poles and Ukrainians, between Czechs and Germans, between Italians and Croats. So this was a national conflict just like any others. And the idea of an exceptional logic underlying or informing anti-Jewish violence was conceptually impossible. Because it would have placed Jews outside the logic of nationalism that dominated the political sphere. And outside the logic of nationalism that would draw the new borders and the new arrangements of these regions. So, I'm now concluding. I'm already almost over time. Roger Brubaker famously once observed that, quote, ethnicity, race and nationhood are fundamentally ways of perceiving, interpreting and representing the social world. They are not things in the world, but perspectives on the world, end quote. And this should direct us to another question, I believe. When are these perspectives on the world adopted? When do they make sense to people? Or when do they start to displace other ways of seeing the world and oneself? During the First World War and in its aftermath, the Jewish population of Galicia was subjected to hitherto unknown pressures and violence, which challenged the traditional security strategies, their forms of belonging and their self-identifications. Much of this was shared, albeit under very specific conditions, of course, with the experiences of other groups and communities throughout the empire. The feeling of betrayal by the Habsburg state, this created a vacuum. Both a practical one relating to security and a more abstract one of who would replace it, or what would replace the old relations in the old state. And where does oneself belong in this new reality? As we can see throughout the vast multinational space, the nationalist perspective on the world in many respects filled this vacuum. This does not mean that people did then necessarily want to implement ethno-nationalist dominance and hegemony and engage in violence to exert it. It was specific local conditions that created these situations, I believe, showing how the idea of sharing the same multinational space remained, despite everything, an important factor in people's thinking about their future and their presence. Also, the perspective on the world also informed the way in which people made sense of this transformation. Both the violence and their ideas or their means to prevent it, or at least how it could be prevented in the future. But these were not natural, inevitable processes. I think that we should, and I try to make a contribution to this, or at least offer my thoughts on that, we should rethink some of these big processes of the demise of the empire, the escalation of violence, the creation of nation states, and intercommunal violence and pogroms. We have to look at the small levels where we may be able to find very different stories and different thinking amongst people. And I think this may allow us to, in turn, to reapproach what we already know about the Jewish story of Galicia, but also of the old Habsburg Empire, and the new Polish state, and the creation of, and the way that people try to make it through a very volatile situation in an incredibly diverse region of Europe. Thank you very much.